In the next session, we'll explore how Brazil can deepen in its integration to European climate strategies through innovation, investment, and collaboration. Please join us, Claudia Martinez Ochoa, Head of Private Equity for Asia and Latin America at Proparco, Faustine de la Salle, CEO of Mission Possible Partnership, Daniel Godinho, Sustainability and Investor Relations Director at WEG, and to moderate, Arthur Ramos, Managing Director and Partner at BCG.
Bonjour, boa tarde. It's a pleasure being here, and it's a pleasure being after this so many good sessions. Thanks a lot, Ricardo, for being here, and always on our role of content partner here. We try to be provocative. It's really delicious for us, consultants, that we get the problem and we go working and discussing with our teams, with the teams of Brazil Climate Summit, some ideas, and we bring these provocative ideas here to you. Okay, so a pleasure. And again, we have from Ambassador Ligan here before, from Rai, from the previous panel that we have. We're talking about sports, we talk about competition. So the bar is very high here for our discussion here, and I'm sure that we're going to be bringing interesting aspect on our discussion. Okay, so on behalf of the Brazilian climate team, I'd like really to thank everyone. We're going to be doing this discussion and also individual questions, but I think it's very good to do this interactive. Okay, if we can bring different points and the panel contributes. We have, of course, pre-scheduled some of the conversation, but I think the debate is much more important. Okay, so we're starting on the hard to abate sectors and the name of the panel, Why Brazil? No? So it's very, very important. I think there are several analyses, there are several PowerPoints, several Excel spreadsheets. That's all the potential that we have. No? But the overriding question on this panel, how to get this materialized, how to get this happening, how to get it going. So I start here with Claudia, and from our experience as investor focus and based in Latin America and Asia. What do you see the most promising investment opportunities that we have in the direction of this Brazil green economy, and how that connects also Europe, because it's a little bit we are here and we're subjacent also to those discussions. Okay, so starting with Claudia, thanks a lot. Okay.
So I head the private equity department at Proparco, which is the French development bank owned by the Agence Française de Développement, and we invest only in private sector and emerging markets. So I head Asia and Latam, so I have a view on both Brazil and Asia. I think Brazil, without a doubt, is at least in our continent, because I'm originally Colombian, a mastodont in terms of the size of its market and the climate opportunities, as we just saw in all the previous panels and studies. But there's still challenges that it needs to face. And again, we saw that in the study that was just presented, particularly with Asia. In my view, Brazil needs to find the right spot in the market where it can create high-value products. So it's precisely as we saw a little while ago, moving up the value chain. Why? Because its cost of labor is never going to be as competitive as Asia's, so there's no point in competing there. But it does have that green premium that Asia does not have. So when we were looking at the previous slides, Brazil, 85% of Brazil's energy mix is renewable between hydro, solar, and wind, while India's, which in the steel and aluminium slide that we saw was the second competitor, the first in exports of steel and aluminium, only 20% of its energy mix is renewable, which is why when we were looking at the premiums, it's very, very dirty Scope 2, Scope 3, but it has leveraged its internal market and positioned itself from a national policy standpoint as a China plus one strategy, which Brazil has not done. So Brazil is still focused on commodity exports and hasn't made that shift yet in deciding as a national policy that they need to leverage its manufacturing base, again, the strongest, best in the entire Latin American continent, with the best research facilities, engineers, etc., with, yes, a large market, but it's puny and tiny compared to 1.5 billion Indians or 1.5 billion Chinese. So Brazil needs to look outside of Brazil and start investing across Latin America to generate economies of scale, and stop thinking about its own market and think ambitiously and say, how can my Brazilian company not just reach scale in Brazil, but reach scale in Latin America and then be able to be competitive with international actors? Otherwise, you're playing a game that's too small, and I hear that too often in Brazil, that I'm in Sao Paulo, so my dream is to go to expand nationally to Minas Gerais, and maybe if I'm courageous, to Nordeste. And I'm like, oh wow, you really need to think much more thoughtfully, and that requires, I think, not just private sector investors, both local, as we mentioned, and actors like us, but also, I think, probably a little bit more thoughtful support from policy.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. And I think it's a very good call, okay, for the Brazilian, speaking as a Brazilian, okay, for how do we think about globally, but also not to forget about Latin America. I think this is a very, very important point. Thanks for bringing that up. So next question, I'd like to hear Faustine. I think she's almost a Brazilian citizen now. I saw her making speeches, making the presentations in Portuguese, and in perfect Portuguese. So great on that. And Faustine, on the Mission Possible partnership, and particularly on the ITA discussion. Okay, I would like you to explore a little bit. Why was that the priority? I don't know if it's the first one that you're doing, but it's such an important one that you're bringing that to Brazil, and also on all the panel reacting here. We'd like to listen to your comments on the perspective you see for the decarbonization of hard-to-abate sectors, but also the potential for moving forward.
Yeah, so at the Mission Possible Partnership and the Industrial Transition Accelerator, which is the UN-backed initiative that we host, we're focusing on unlocking first-of-a-kind projects in those hard-to-abate sectors, and looking at the opportunity across emerging markets, because we have the assumption that there is going to be a profound shift in the localization of industry going forward. Just as coal-based activities a century or 2 centuries back co-located with coal mines, our assumption is that energy-intensive industries are going in the future to become clean and therefore need to locate where there is abundant, cheap, renewable energy. And that's not necessarily Europe, it may be the US, but a lot of that potential sits in emerging economies like Brazil. So when we launched the ITA back at COP28, we looked at which countries we could go into that had the convergence of favorable conditions to see first-of-a-kind projects emerge. And Brazil topped the list. For the reasons that have already been mentioned today, it topped the list because of its natural resources, its renewable energy potential, the diversity of its renewable energy potential as well, because it's not just solar, it's solar plus wind plus hydro. It topped the list because of its resources in terms of bauxite and in terms of iron ore that we already spoke about. Also because of its political will and the engagement from the government to mobilize around this agenda. And we've had a partnership with MEDIC, so the Ministry of Development, Industry and Trade, for the past 2 years. That has been very important for us progressing in Brazil. And what has also caught our attention in Brazil is the fact that there's an industrial base to start working with, an industrial base that is already relatively low carbon with the rest of the world, and both domestic and export opportunities. And I think it's important, to your point earlier, to think big in terms of exports to Europe, but not only to Europe, to mobilize the rest of Latin America as well, but also to look to the domestic market, because there are specific spots of opportunities in the domestic market from our perspective, especially where Brazil is importing a hell of a lot. So that's nitrogen fertilizers, that's methanol, where almost everything that's consumed in Brazil is imported at high cost, and where there's an opportunity to produce locally and to produce green, to also unlock investment in projects that will mature the technologies, that will mature the infrastructure required to then go after the value-adding opportunities in steel and aluminium that we've been speaking about already.
Thanks a lot, Faustine. Thanks for the comments here. And then moving to Daniel Godinho here and WEG as a very important player, global, a very interesting case of success of Brazil on high value-added products, industrial products. But I'd like you to explore a little bit the innovation, the importance of innovation on taking the advantage of Brazil and also playing in fields that are not typically the ones that Brazil play in the commodity range. Okay.
All right, good afternoon. So I speak on behalf of WEG. WEG is a Brazilian global company that manufactures electric and electronic equipment that goes all along the energy chain, from the very generation of energy until the final consumption, going through distribution, transmission, automation, everything. If you think of energy, we're there with our products and solutions. And of course, if we work in this field, we have to think always about innovation together with sustainability, right? For us, both are in the very core of our business strategy. They need to walk together. And how do we make them walk together? First, some numbers I think it's important to be shared. In terms of innovation, 55% of our revenue comes from products released in the market in the last 5 years. So this is concrete outcome of innovation. Of course, it takes a lot of investment in R&D and innovation to get to these numbers. But if you don't have a commitment and processes in order to make sure that the invested money goes and delivers results, you don't get there, right? So these are concrete numbers. And we add sustainability to that because 73% of our revenue, of our net revenue, also comes from sustainable products according to FTSE. And the way we must combine these things, we align our offer of products in 4 different pillars, so to say: energy efficiency, operational efficiency meaning digitalization, automation, and electrification of processes, renewable energies, and electrical mobility. And by doing so, we guarantee that these are applied in our customers in order to make them more sustainable, make them greener. So we use our innovation to deliver sustainable results to our clients, and that's why we believe and we make sure those 2 things always work together.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rodinho, here for the perspective. So moving back also to the investor perspective, Claudia, I think you mentioned a little bit the scale challenge and the broader perspective on that. What do you see as key barriers? What are the difficulties of when you perceive particularly on the Brazilian investment side, and how they could be overcome?
I think I'll give a little bit of the barriers, but also of positive things. Maybe I'll start with the positive. So, for example, Brazil has one of the strongest regulatory frameworks in renewables, in wind and solar. So it really is easy to invest because it's a well-regulated environment, and it shows. That's why the sector keeps growing. So it's a really good thing. The other thing recently, in the last couple of years, was a regulatory change. It's very specific that allows us as investors to invest directly in Brazilian companies with the figure of the FIPE, which is the investment vehicle used in Brazil. It's limited, similar to a limited partnership outside of Brazil. Before that, it was impossible for a foreign investor to invest directly into a company in Brazil because of lack of corporate liability protections. So I think that's a super positive change that has, at least in our case, opened up the possibility to be more active in direct investments. In terms of downside, I think one of the things that is most difficult, I think, also to find a solution is foreign exchange volatility. I think Brazil has one of the most volatile currencies, at least in the markets that I oversee, of all of Asia and all Latam. Colombia is second behind, and it's very similar because both are tied to commodity prices. So every time price oil goes up and down, the Brazilian real collapses or increases. While Asia is incredibly stable. I have devaluations of maybe 5% per year, where Brazil can see swings of 40% in one single year. That deters foreign investors that invest like me in euros or dollars, because what do we do when we need to get out of an investment in a bad year when the real has lost 40%? So the question is very difficult. We try to manage it. One of the things I would say is there's not enough, at least I haven't seen solutions being offered by, for example, BNDES to try to provide, for example, first loss specific for FX for foreign investors, for example, investing in Brazilian private equity funds, which we're investors in many of Brazilians' private equity funds. They invest at par with us as investors, and I do wonder if there's a role for someone to come up. I mean, we obviously, unfortunately, we are like in that same difficulty that we cannot offer a first loss, but there's clearly a missing gap for that FX volatility. So it's quite difficult to manage as an investor. So I think that's one of the most, for me, the most difficult barrier. The investment barriers that Brazil historically had have been reduced dramatically. It's still a little bit more difficult to do business in Brazil than it is, I don't know, in a neighboring country like Colombia, but 1,000 times easier than India. So I would say it's been a long way, and we can now invest relatively easily, and particularly there's no added difficulty whether it's infra, green, or normal. So that's a good thing. But unfortunately for FX, yeah, I think collectively we need to think of A, how to do a short-term solution, but B, the real-term solution would be to start diversifying the economy seriously away from commodities and into higher added value products, as we've been discussing. Again, also because Brazil has a green premium that other economies don't necessarily have. And it's been too easy historically to focus on commodities. It's like the lower hanging fruit, and obviously there's more effort and more difficulty in moving up the value chain, but I think it's a necessity to A, boost GDP growth, create more skilled jobs. I mean, there's a million trickle-down effect that would generate, and part of that would definitely help with FX, because that's why Asia has a flat FX, because they're exporters, basically.
Great. Oh, thanks again. And then, Faustine, I think taking a little bit on the way we ended at the last, you mentioned there's a lot of deficit on our export, on our import side, import profile on some of these commodities, but anyway, even tackling that in parallel or directly, but how do you see the potential for Brazil also contributing not only for internal but also supplying with those low carbon products and particularly for the EU? Okay.
So I want to build on what has just been said, which is that FX is a big issue for investment in the country. The cost of capital, therefore, is also a big issue. And that's what we see in investment in, for instance, brownfield, clean industrial projects in Brazil, in the cement sector, in the aluminium sector where we're working, where there's tremendous projects that we have on our map that we're working with that are only blocked by the cost of capital. And so that's extremely frustrating, because we could have aluminium production that is even greener than it already is and could really capture lead markets for very, very green aluminium out there that are unable to do so because of cost of capital. So that's the layer around investment. Then if I go towards the broader portfolio of projects we're seeing in Brazil, both focused on the domestic market and focused on the export market, especially exports to Europe. And we're working with about 15 projects right now, 11 officially announced, a few more that are going to be announced in the next few days. Out of 20 projects or so that we've identified, so commercial scale, clean industrial projects in sectors like cement, steel, aluminium, sustainable aviation fuels. Where we see the biggest potential right now, and that translates into numbers of projects, is hydrogen-based projects. So hydrogen transformed into ammonia for exports towards Europe, hydrogen transformed into ammonia for fertilizer production locally, hydrogen transformed into e-methanol for both domestic and local export, and obviously then hydrogen used to reduce iron locally rather than ship iron ore across the globe. The challenges we see for those projects are really, and there are several, but two really come out on top. One is certainty of demand markets, because a lot of those projects, as I said, eye towards Europe as an export market, but are still not fully sure of how they will navigate CBAM, and are still not fully sure of how European policy around lead markets for clean commodities like clean steel or sustainable aviation fuels will evolve in the next 12 months, and how open or closed the doors will be to imports from the rest of the world, including Brazil. So that's one area that I think requires much more collaboration and cooperation between European players and Brazilian players to really understand to what extent Europe will open its doors, what will be the conditions that will have to be met, and how Brazil can tap into that export potential. On the domestic market front, we have a similar issue that I think historically industry players have been eyeing towards Europe as the export opportunity and have potentially underestimated the local Brazilian but also the broader Latin American market as a market for clean commodities, and therefore we don't have the policies in place internally within Brazil, for instance to incentivize the use of lower carbon fertilizers in the agricultural industry. So the market creation locally is also really important. So market is one of the big issues. The second big issue we see, and that's quite contradictory, is actual access to clean energy. Because we've been speaking a lot to date of the fantastic renewable potential of the country. But what we're seeing is that the most mature projects we had in our portfolio just arrived to a halt a month ago because they were refused grid connection. Because the grid, the power system is not set up in a way that it allows for new energy-intensive, heavy industries that will require a massive load to connect to the local grid. So I think those are the two issues I would focus on in terms of challenges to be resolved to unlock investment.
Thanks. And again, here, I'm taking the perspective, Daniel, I know you have also financial background, the cost of capital. We're talking about here the ESG commitments and things like that. That was the question to you, but also taking advantage of the discussion here, and as a Brazilian company and investing and a global investor, how do you tackle also the issues of cost of capital, and also how do you use that in order to help the companies to decarbonize their own supply?
Cost of capital is for sure very important issue in Brazil. We deal with customers globally, but when it comes to Brazil, especially for the middle and small enterprises, it's a big deal how to engage them in this agenda. So, for instance, in our case, we have a sustainable supplier program by which we try to engage our suppliers. And we have so far been able to engage around 900 suppliers out of 7,500 of suppliers of raw materials to WEG. And out of curiosity, 80% of them come from Europe. And we realized that about 50% of the whole supply chain of WEG have, for instance, commitments in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, which is not good enough, right? It's not good enough at all. And the very same number applies to the suppliers here in Europe. So we're trying to bring them to the agenda, but again, when it comes to middle and small companies, it's always more costly, and that's when, again, cost of capital comes to play. In the case of Brazil, BNDES is doing a good job in order to help us out on that, and we expect to have more and more of this in order to move the agenda forward.
Thank you, Daniel. Claudia, come back to you, and again exploring the very important standpoint that you have, and you tackle a little bit the difference between Asia and Brazil. But if you could go deeper a little bit and some advice for the audience here, and what you see could be important areas, important elements to unblock potential investment and bridge the gaps, even the cost of capital and some of the that were mentioned here. Okay.
So maybe first of all, I would say that the sectors in which, and I will take India as an example because I think it's a good comparison with Brazil, that they both can play or are playing in within the climate space is quite similar, but where Brazil has actually some bigger advantages. So one obviously is clean energy, the second is the agri-sector, regenerative agriculture and climate resilient agriculture, and the third would be urban solutions, so water, waste management, recycling, electric mobility, etc. I think the two countries both are playing in different ways. I'll give you a concrete example of, because I was just last week, the entire week doing in India, dedicated to climate discussions with private equity funds and companies. So it was very, and in March I did the same thing in Brazil, so it's very enlightening to do the comparison. So for example, India took the decision less than 2 years ago to ban all imports of solar panels from China. They said it's not enough, they come here, the only thing we do is we assemble them and do the solar installations. We need to move further up the value chain and become a true China plus one. But how do we do that? By reaching scale. And the way to reach scale, yes, it's a very, I could say, dirigiste economic policy, but the result as an investor is that today they've become locally able to compete from a price standpoint with Chinese solar panels. That's one. And we were investors through one of our PE funds in a company called Premier, which manufactures solar panels. We did the most successful IPO in the last 30 years in India, which has the most liquid capital markets in all emerging markets, the Bombay stock market, where we did a return of 40x. I'm not a VC investor, I'm a private equity investor in a solar panel manufacturer. Why? Because there's the demand that was created exactly as you mentioned, local demand, but it was a national decision to say this is a priority for us as a country. Yes, we need to move to renewables, but we need to move in the value chain, so everything else has followed. So now Brazil is a little bit step behind. They're doing solar panel assembly, but nobody's manufacturing solar panels. Could they? Probably, but they would need the right incentives to be able to do so. There's other areas like battery storage, for example, that you were mentioning the grid. We're seeing the same thing. One of the things that is making us nervous is curtailment in the grid right now. And the only way to be able is to invest, in the grid through transformers, upgrade the grid to be able to take more volatile, more unstable renewable energy, but also battery storage. There are companies producing batteries right now with heavy competition from Chinese, but I think it's part of a national policy to also, at what point do you allow that competition if it's not a fair competition, as we saw on the previous slide, meaning scope 2, scope 3 emissions, to, inhibit your own domestic production. So it's, I guess you're saying to be provocative, it's being provocative, that it's a question to be asked, I think. It's not an easy it's not an easy decision, also noting, of course, that China is the first buyer of Brazilian commodities, so it's a difficult choice, but at some point you also need to think, I guess, towards the future, where you want to go as a country. So I do compare both, and I do realize that there's some national decisions that have been made that have boosted some clean sectors, and that have made also, for example, capital markets is another one that I think is very important. The Sao Paulo Stock Exchange, yes, it is the most liquid in Latin America, but it is still relatively illiquid compared to Bombay. So an example I keep hearing from my Brazilian counterparts that to be able to, IPOs have been closed at least for 3 years, but if you want an IPO, you need at least a $50 million EBITDA. That's huge. Well, in India, the equivalent, you have companies with maybe 5 times, 6 times less than that IPOing. So it just, why? Because markets are much deeper, it's much more democratic in terms of the regular Indian white-collar worker invests in capital markets. Mm-hmm. That is not the case. So they leverage 1.5 billion people, and so there's a lot of liquidity in the markets, and it makes investment incredibly attractive because you know you can get out, and you don't, and FX is less of an issue. So I think it's a very complex answer, but it means you have to work on multiple fronts. You also have to improve and deepen capital markets. You have to have a more to-the-point economic strategy. Maybe I say this also because I'm also French, so I also think that the state has a role to play in in pushing economic policy. But it is, I mean, it is striking to see that. For example, in e-mobility, actually Brazil is doing it the other way from India, which I find fascinating. The Asian way of doing it is through VC, trying to electrify what they call two-wheelers and three-wheelers, so motorbikes and tuk-tuks, basically, because that's the brunt of their traffic in their streets. That's not the case in Latin America at all. So Brazil is doing a different approach. Some really, that we've invested in, are trying to create, from scratch, platforms to do urban short-circuit deliveries for all the Amazons of the world, starting with Sao Paulo, but the level of investment is massive. When we were discussing amounts, they were telling me we're going to buy 20,000 medium-sized trucks for Sao Paulo. That's only that is $300 million of investment. And if I want to go from Sao Paulo to Rio, to Bogota, to Mexico, to Buenos Aires, it's billions. So I guess it's capital and policy.
No, and Claudia, thanks a lot here for the conference, for being very provocative also, and I'm sure we're going to have several of the topics for future agendas of the Brazil Climate Summit. Okay, so very, and Faustina, I think building a little bit on the things also you mentioned on the short-term effect. I think that we're in Brazil, maybe for the long term, we're good at planning. Okay, so I think we're very proud of our power system, integrated system that was built in like 70 years and anything like that. Okay, but these announcements and these projects and the hydrogen and large demand, it's in there for 5 or 6 or 5 years, or 5 years at least. And now when you get to Rio, as the connection, there are some. So I'd like you to explore how to overcome that, and also to mention how they influence the key projects that's part of the ITA. Okay.
So it is very challenging to get that series of first-of-a-kind projects financed, because you both have to go for quick wins and resolve the structural issues at the same time. And the structural issues generally take a long time to be resolved. And so managing those tensions is a difficult task. And I see, and we're operating in Brazil, we're operating in the Middle East and North Africa and India as well. The approach we see in the Middle East is very different than the approach we see in Brazil. And it's highly focused on quick win interventions, exceptional circumstances negotiated directly between companies and with government to make the conditions right for that first of a kind, regardless of what happens for the rest, while progressing at the same time the structural reforms that will benefit the longer tail of projects. I think in Brazil, we're seeing a much greater focus on addressing the structural issues, but then that prevents those first-of-a-kind projects to move as quickly as possible. And to come back to something you said earlier, this is a race, because Brazil is on the line to become a provider of clean commodities to the world, but so is India, so is the Middle East, so is North Africa, so is Australia, which has a history of industrial developments as well. And the European market is big, but it's not that big to absorb all of the projects from all of those regions. So I would strongly encourage government and companies in Brazil to think about the quick wins that can bring some of those first-of-a-kind projects to the front at COP30 and in the following months. Because that's a way to start making or taking the share of a nascent market. And that's important to then be able to build on that to win that leadership race that is starting now.
Excellent, thanks. And then Godinho, if you could share some examples here on effective collaboration between your clients, your global clients, and how they allow your internationalization strategy.
All right, so I'll probably tackle daily business for us, which is to sell efficient electric motors. I'll share a number with you that maybe some of you will be surprised. More than 0.5% of world's consumption of energy comes from electric motors. I'm talking about 53%. So you can imagine the impact of working on efficiency on these motors, right? So the relationship is pretty straightforward. The more efficient an electric motor is, the less consumption of energy it will have and the less emissions of CO2 it will have. So by working on efficiency on a daily basis, we provide our clients with solutions that decarbonize their process and therefore help them achieving their targets in terms of the sustainability agenda. I could also mention a very specific example, like a marine important, it's actually the most relevant company, European company in the world in terms of suction dredgers. And they challenged us to electrify those, and we with an innovative solution, we were able to use electric motors on that, again, decarbonizing their process. But I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention an example here that could be also used worldwide, that is about storage, energy storage. I've just come back from the Amazon region. I was there last week inaugurating a project in a isolated community, where Natura, Brazilian global company of cosmetics, takes most of their raw material from. Most of their raw material comes from the Amazon region. And of course, this region is all, when it comes to energy supply, is 100% dependent upon diesel, right? So we were able to build an agro industry, meaning that the process that would be made in other parts of the country will be now made in the Amazon region. In this project, we estimate that it will raise about 60% of their income. So it's a fantastic social and economic project. But we were able to use a solar system combined with BESS, battery energy storage system, all produced in Brazil. Of course, we don't produce the battery cells there, but we import the cells, but we manufacture the BESS using a national solution in terms of BMS, battery managed system, national converters, and other technologies that combined bring to the region resilience in terms of energy supply, and also, of course, a clean and technological solution. And this could be used not only in the Amazon region, but also in all sorts of isolated communities, in all sorts of off-grid systems all over the world. So this is the kind of things I believe we should be showcasing during COP30 to make Brazil being seen not only as a supplier of commodities, but also in terms of technologies that we do have there and are available not only for Brazil, but also to the world.
I think it's an excellent way to close in here, and I think bringing also on specific opportunities also that you have with all aligned with all the objectives we've seen before. But I think we cover first of a kind, we cover the importance of policy, and I think the importance of also not only looking to our own belly. In Brazil, I think it's very important. I think India is a very interesting case for COP and for everything like that of the cooperation. So I'd like to close here. Now we were talking about football in Brazil. It's not the best moment for football in Brazil. We are importing a coach here from Europe, so Carlo Ancelotti just arrived. So that's a little bit of our globalization here, and I think it's a change of paradigm for Brazil. And of course, thanking a lot here our speakers for the great contribution and also for keeping the time. Okay, thanks a lot.